Welcome to our webinar called Federal Funding Opportunities for Livestock Farmers. Our presenter today is Margaret Krome with the Michael Fields Agricultural Institute. This webinar is hosted by Food Animal Concerns Trust. I am Larissa McKenna, FACT's Humane Farming Program Director, and I will be moderating today's session. So thank you everyone for being here. A few quick introductions in case you're not familiar with FACT. Food Animal Concerns Trust, or FACT, we are a nonprofit organization. We're based out of Illinois. We do work across the country. And we work to ensure that all food-producing animals are raised in a healthy and humane manner. We accomplish this by supporting humane farmers, such as yourselves, promoting policies that make food from animals safe and healthy to eat, and then also helping consumers make informed food choices. So I have the honor and pleasure of working as the director of the Humane Farming Program, which means I get to work with farmers across the country to support you. We provide a number of services, including scholarships, materials, grants, a mentorship program, and of course, a variety of webinars on fascinating topics. So I invite you to visit our website to learn more about all of our farmer services. All right, so at this time, I am delighted to introduce our esteemed presenter, Margaret Krome. As Policy Program Director at the Michael Fields Agricultural Institute in East Troy, Wisconsin, Margaret has more than 2 decades of experience in federal and state policy development, supporting environmentally sound, profitable, and socially responsible agriculture. Margaret sits on the board of the National Center for Appropriate Technology, or NCAT. She coordinates a farmer-led watershed group in Southwest Wisconsin, and she's active on several agricultural initiatives related to climate and market resilience, among the many, many things that she does. So we're really, really lucky to have her with us today to talk about how to find and apply for federal funding programs. So I think without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, Margaret, so that you may begin your presentation. So take it away.
Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Larissa. So I'm going to just make sure that I understand how to move this forward. At the moment, I'm not seeing the little button that says move. So I might need to have you do that.
So if you just scroll right over your name, they should appear with your mouse at the bottom of the slide.
Right. That is exactly. Yeah. You're perfect. You've got it all figured out. Thank you so much. I appreciate that help. So, and if I am understanding from you, Larissa, that the others are seeing the full screen, or am I incorrect? Should I go ahead and close off my video so that people see the screen and not me?
It is up to you. I mean, people see the slides and you're at the top, okay, but it's up to you. Yeah.
I'm going to say hi, everybody, and then I'm going to exit, but stay right here. I just don't think that, I think it's nicer for folks to see more and see less of me. So I'm going to see if I can't make myself less visible and make this bigger. Are you the one who makes it bigger, or am I? There you go. We're good. Thank you. Appreciate that. So it's really great to have everyone here. I'm excited. I'm always excited when people are interested in using federal resources. As Larissa said, I've spent a lot of years with so many others who are committed to using and helping to get federal programs created and funded and well implemented. And then it's, of course, for no point if we don't have people using them. So I will just give you a moment of history about this workshop itself and just say that this workshop I started back in the mid-90s. And the reason was I had spent several years already, and I spent another 15 or so after that, working to coordinate the grassroots appropriations campaign for the sustainable ag movement around the country. And, we were just really, really worked hard to get funding for programs. And it began to strike me that it wasn't clear to me that enough people knew that those programs were there. So I approached some funders and said, don't you think it'd be great if we put together a guide to federal programs that are out there? And they said, absolutely. And it turns out that the National Sustainable Ag Research Education Program, SARE, had a similar idea right around the same time. So we joined forces right from the start and created this guide that you will see later on. And this guide is, it's in its, I don't know, 6th edition maybe. After every farm bill, we wait a few months and then we put one together to update it with the most recent information. But even starting at the beginning, I said to folks in my world, so what do you think ought to be included in a workshop about this? I don't want to put a guide together and have it sit on a shelf. What do you think about putting together workshops about how to use, how to find federal funding and successfully apply for it? And the one thing that I heard that I hadn't thought about was you should start with a piece about how do you design good projects in the first place? They said it's nothing so frustrating as having a lot of applications come in that are not for projects that were not well designed in the first place. That's why we have that in this workshop now. And so without further ado, I'm just going to jump right in and do a quick introduction of Michael Fields Agricultural Institute. You see where we are, and we are located in East Troy, Wisconsin. And we have a research program, we have an education program, and a policy program, and I head up the policy program. And today's workshop is going to be divided into these 3 basic sections. One is how do you design sound projects, as I just said. And then the one that was more obvious to me at the front end, identifying possible funding. How do you find funding? Some of the questions some of you sent in ahead of time included that question. We'll get to that. And then the third piece is grant writing basics. I will offer an extra little piece at the end that's not included in that framework, but I found over the years people often find it helpful, and we'll do that if folks would find it helpful. And that is to do a little quick comparison of the strategies and the structures of applying to agencies versus applying to foundations. There's a lot of similarities, but there are some differences and some different strategies and approaches that result. So I suggest it, but don't insist upon it. I think I'll get a little bit of feedback from the chat box if people would find that last little piece helpful. So let's jump right in on how do you design sound projects. And one of the things I should tell you about this workshop is my contention has always been people are often a little bit intimidated by the idea of grant writing. But people don't realize that they actually have in their heads already the kinds of things that would be helpful to keep in mind in designing sound projects and then writing proposals. So this whole workshop is going to be predicated on having you give a little bit of feedback in the chat box. Usually, of course, we do this interactively in person, but we can use the chat box that way. And so I'm going to have you just give me a little bit of feedback at the front end here. And that is this. As you just live your lives, as we all live our lives, we sometimes, see projects, whether it's a school project or a local hospital project or a youth project or not necessarily just agricultural. And we see these things, and some of them we think, ugh, not going to succeed. And some of them we think, it nails it. It's going to be a winner. So my question to you is, could you put in the chat box, regardless of what kind of project, whether it's a business or a community project or whatever, what tells you that a project's going to succeed? And I'm going to try to grab them as they come and put up and just voice out a few of the things that you all say. So starting in the chat box here, same place you put your names in, just note, what are the things that tell you, regardless of kind of project, that it's going to be a success? Amount of resources needed, clearly defined goals, yes, clear objectives, defined benefits, a project that solves a problem, clear map of the project timeline, farmer experience, yes, the personnel who knows what they're doing, demand, quality evaluation, leadership, output, community buy-in. Boy, you all are so on. That's really great. I think I'm going to do these things by Zoom in the future or video, whatever. Wow. Quality results, yes. Commitment. Each of the participants gave their interest in participating, are on board and excited. Yeah, fire in your belly. Okay. And aligned with ancient, yes. Okay, now that's getting to how you write a good proposal, but absolutely right. We'll get to grant writing, and you can, Roger, bring that point in. I think we've captured a lot right there. So let's jump in. Thank you, everybody. I love that you're so ready to jump in. So let's, I'm going to do what I used not to do. I used to not hand out handouts at the beginning because I wanted people to be interactive. Obviously, today we can't do that. And I would wait until I'd kind of made people become more interactive, and then I would give them a handout to write in. But you should have downloaded a handout, and you should be able to use these to take notes and elaborate and think through, and if you had further questions and so forth. So when you design sound projects, some of the questions you ought to be asking are, what's the problem you're trying to address? What are your goals and measurable objectives? That's what some of you all said. And, somebody said need. I really start with need too. Is there a need or an opportunity that you see? And then you go to say, so if that's true, then what are we trying to accomplish, even in broad terms, and then more measurable objectives? And I'll give you a little example. Well, I'll use this workshop as an example. I said the problem I was addressing with the workshop was I felt like there were a lot of people who didn't know that federal programs were out there that could be useful to them. So needless to say, one of my goals is to help have more people using federal programs to meet the needs of the work that is, our shared set of goals, I think, which is building agriculturally based, strong communities, healthy farms, environmentally sound practices that are profitable and socially responsible. And that's my goal, is to help people use federal resources in that direction. And my measurable objectives, you could say, for these workshops, when I do them, it could be X number of workshops per year. I want to have people find that they actually meet the needs that they had as they came into the workshop. I would like to see more people using federal resources, and I particularly target underserved people. And historically, USDA has some terminology for it, but basically, Black and brown people who have historically not been well served by USDA. I want to make sure that they get access and know about these. So that's an example of some goals and objectives. Measurable objectives. I can say how many workshops, number of workshops, how many underserved farmers or organizations working with underserved farmers, and so forth. Another question you might ask is, have other people addressed this problem? Are you the very first person who ever thought about it? What can you learn from the work of other people who have already, maybe in some other place, taken this idea on? What can you learn? And in some cases, maybe collaborate. And speaking of collaboration, who else might care about this problem of yours? Who else might think that this is an important thing to take on? Should they be in your project? And I'll give you an example. Right at the moment, I'm in the middle of writing not one, not two, but 3 grant proposals. Not my favorite thing in the world to be doing. I do have written grant proposals for 35 years, but it's, 3 at a time is quite a lot for me. And in each case, I'm working with other people, and we'll come into why it can help. It's exciting, and you get new ideas, and you have buy-in from people who can help bring resources to bear on the thing you're taking on. There is such a thing as too many people. And also, when I'm thinking about who I want to bring into a project, frankly, I'm picky. Why make your life hard? There are those people, those difficult people who want to tell you what you ought to do without offering to help. You don't need to waste your time and make your life miserable. Be conscious that when you're designing a project, you get to pick the people who are not only smart, capable, experienced, bring resources potentially, but are also, collaborative and a pleasure to work with. And you don't want too many of them, because too many cooks in the kitchen can make your life hard. Question: what's your main strategy to address your problem? Among several options, this is sort of my general reminder to myself. Whenever I'm thinking I'm wanting to take on a thing, whether it's a personal thing, a family thing, a work thing, a project, community project, regardless, I start off, and I think the idea I had at the outset is just brilliant, frankly. It's just the best idea ever was. And I force myself to say, how might I accomplish those goals in a different way? What other strategies might I? And I force myself to have options. I know I can tell you, my family would tell you I do this, and it's sometimes a little frustrating, but I insist that we make sure we've considered other ways of accomplishing the thing we want to accomplish. And then it means we're liberated to open our heads and become creative. And that's an important strategy in my mind. So, next question is, what's a realistic project timeline? Some of you spoke to timeline. You know, I will confess that it is not my greatest strength. Being on time, getting everything prepared, it is so important to give yourself realistic time and be practical. We had a little project years ago when our kids were in elementary school. We wanted to create an outdoor classroom. And we had I wrote a grant, got funding, also did some community organizing and fundraising, and we had this grand project. It was really successful and a very thoughtful timeline. Thank goodness we had been generous in our timeline offering, because guess what happened? Just before we were about to put in all of the, new beds and paths and get all the vegetation planted, the city decided very appropriately, the school district, that this 90-plus-year-old school ought to have its lead based painted windows removed and replaced with more energy efficient ones. And you don't really want all that lead showering down upon your garden. So we went to the city, the people who had funded us, and said, hey, by the way, we've gotten XYZ done on time, but we're going to have to pause on this planting because we don't want to be planting into very lead heavy soil, and it's not good for children. Everyone went, oh, right. Thank you. And thank you for being on time with everything else. We have confidence. This little bump in the road's no big deal. And it wasn't. But anyway, that realistic project timeline is critical. Keep it flexible. What resources does your project require? And which do you already have? Those of you who have written grant proposals before can probably begin to imagine that this question here is getting to not only budgets, but also to matching resources. So I'm asking the question, what do we need to do to make this thing happen, whether it's a business or whatever? And those things typically fall into three categories. It's usually people, money, and stuff. And some of you said, you want to have people involved who are, have fire in their belly, people who are excited and engaged and experienced. Yep. And you want to have a budget that's well thought through and targeted. We'll come to that later. And then sometimes, you need to have materials. You need to have high, tinsel fencing for your livestock. You need to have whatever you need, maybe software for whatever you need to do on your computer, whatever it is. Some of it you might already have, and that might be something you wouldn't have been conscious of. You would have just assumed it. But if you're going to put together a project, note what you already have available to you, and then what else you need. And just be intentional about thinking in those terms. And you will see when we come to grant writing that translates into providing matching resources. Many programs require it, not all. Who else needs to know about your project? What's the best way to reach that audience? Well, I'd say the first thing to say is you should decide it. For your project, is it something where really the most important audience is in your own community? In which case, maybe, what do you think? Going to the Shopper Stopper, talking to the local newspaper, maybe the radio, if there's a local radio station or whatever. Or if it's regional or if it's national, maybe you might think about the internet, other strategies, working through organizations that are interested in the same topics, but be thoughtful. Who needs to know about your project, and what's the best way to reach that audience? And then how will you ultimately know how will you evaluate your project's outcomes? And somebody put into the question that I asked earlier, a good evaluation. A good project could tell you at the outset how it's going to know if it's succeeded. And so you can say at the outset, we'll know if we've succeeded if we have, you can go back to those measurable objectives I mentioned, if I conduct 6 to 8 workshops, or if a percentage of those workshops is targeting underserved participants and stakeholders, or whatever you might say. Just a note that when you think about evaluation, 2 or 3 thoughts. One is, for some people, the idea of evaluation is kind of like a trip to the woodshed. It's like, ugh, I know I haven't gotten things done on time. I know everything wasn't just as I planned it from the outset. So just prepare yourself for the fact that a good evaluation should tell the warts as well as the joyful news. That you should talk about what's really succeeded. Was a time I was really concerned that there were some problems actually in grass-based agriculture, and some of us around the country were having the same problems, but not talking enough about the problem parts. We were all making the same mistakes, and if we were a little bit more open about the problems as well as successes, we could have perhaps advanced more quickly and helped new startups succeed as well. So that's it's an important part of rethinking what you're going to do next, is to be honest with yourself about what did succeed and what didn't. Usually when I'm doing this workshop interactively and I can see you and you can see me, I have everyone raise your hand. How many people have ever had a project where, or any enterprise, where the thing you said at the outset you were going to do happened exactly as you planned it, and your work plan was satisfied to a T? It just doesn't happen. Nobody raises their hands if you ask that question, because we all know there are bumps in the road. And so evaluation should not be a trip to the woodshed. Keep it honest, say what's good and what's bad. And then the other thing I want to say is, it's sometimes way easier to do your evaluation against those measurable objectives. Did I do X, Y, Z? But that isn't actually ultimately what you care about, right? You ultimately care about, am I achieving my goals? And keep in mind, most projects are short-term if you're getting funding, you're probably getting funding maybe for a year or 2 or 3, but you're hoping the project usually is going to be longer term. So you're only capturing a little slice of time in a project trajectory. You probably can't say definitively, oh yes, we have accomplished the thing we wanted. You can more likely say, we're on the path toward it. And you ask, what are the indicators of being on that path? There are various strategies, and honestly, there are week-long workshops on evaluation, which obviously we're not taking on now. But just to point out, there are lots of ways to do it. You will see in the evaluation that we hand out at the very end, one of the ways I use this in this project is just to ask you, did this workshop increase the likelihood that you will be writing a proposal for federal funding within the next year on sustainable ag? And that's my attempt to get at that goal question. And whatever you do for your projects, keep in mind that's what you want to do. Make sure you're not forgetting it's not just objectives, it's also that big picture. Figure out a way to try to get to that. So before we get to this next section, I'll come back here so we don't get distracted. We can take some questions. If anyone has a few questions, we could take 2 or 3 minutes here. I don't want to spend tons of time because it was the lowest priority for spending, our collective time. So I want to see if there's anything important that anyone wants to point out or any questions anyone wants to ask. And if not, we'll gallop on into the next one. So just pausing for a minute here. Don't see questions. So I'm going to give it about another 10 seconds and on we go. All right. So next discussion is, how do we identify funding? How do we find funding that's important and suited for our purposes? So I'm going to ask you all again a couple questions and let you all use the chat box here to answer. So in general, when you are looking for funding, where do you, or if you never have looked for funding, what strikes you as the strategies that you would most likely pursue? And don't forget the fact that I used to ask this question before there was an internet and people had answers. So what are the ways that you think people might find funding? I want you to go ahead and type in the chat box for a second. We will use that. You can ask NRCS. Yes. Ask local NRCS, FSA, Extension, talk to Extension. Woo, it's so fast. It's so hard for me to keep up with them. They're zinging. My network, yes, I'm so pleased to see a few of these. Livestock associations, local organizations go through FACT, great. Google small farm grants, excellent, thanks. USDA, county extension, reaching out to your local ag department, other farmers. I hope nobody ever looked before. That's great. Using the internet, we will come to that. Yep. This is great. Thank you all. That was really helpful. And I like, word of mouth. That was absolutely, we'll come back to all of those. Thanks for all of your good ideas. Farming groups, yep. So, I'm seeing if I can move this. Yeah. So I'm going to start and point out that you can get a copy of one example of a way to find funding. And it is this guide right now. I'm going to turn my camera back on just for a second here and show you my copy in real time. And can you see it? Yeah. So we have just finished. I mentioned that we put together a guide every several years after the Farm Bill, usually a year or so, usually within a year of a Farm Bill, typically if we can. This time it was a little longer for a variety of reasons, and you can imagine some of those reasons probably. But we will go into this. I wanted to tell you, in addition to the link that you see here, which is at the website for the National Center for Appropriate Technology, ATRA, one of the most collaborative agencies you've ever known, really wonderful organization. And you can go to their website and you can download it at the link that I have there. But you also, if you haven't ever used ATRA, you might want to just give it a call. There's a number. And I think, Larissa, this would be great if you could put it into the chat box, the 1-800-346-9140. It's one of those numbers I have memorized over the years because I've given it to so many people. But you can call them and they can actually send you a copy. You can, if you haven't ever used ATRA, just to point out to you, they have a wealth of information on tremendously valuable range of topics, and a lot of them would be useful to you. Lots of really great information about livestock. And a lot of them folks today, getting ready for this talk, asked about small farmers. They have a lot of information about small farmers. You don't have to be a large farmer to have information from ATRA. But anyway, they have a copy of this, and you can download it from their website. And they also have copies that they can send, hard copies, such as the one I showed you. So that's one example. We'll come into that. We'll come back to this guide in a few. I'm trying to forward it, and I don't seem to be doing very well. Here we are. I think it's going to go. It takes a sec. There we go. There are other places, and this was another question that one of you asked. And so I'm passing along a little bit more detailed information about where do you find funding. Somebody said in their questions, can you get one-stop shop, like to get a lot of information about federal programs that are available? Yes, you can. It's not obvious how. So I spent some time last week talking with the lovely people at grants.gov. This is a website that is the website you're going to love to hate. It's kind of a nuisance-y website. It's part of your life. However, if you're putting in federal programs, you're probably going to connect. Not always, not every program, but mostly you will. And there are things about it that are annoying as anything, and there are things that are really great. One of the things that's great is they have a 1-800 number. You see it at the bottom of this page, and it's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Can you believe it? Really helpful, kind people. And I talked with not one, not two, but 3 of them last week to make sure this information's right. What you can do is you can basically say to this grants.gov, hey, grants.gov, I want information about click, 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 click. And this will help you get to it. And then they will send you information about those kind of categories of programs. So I'm not going to belabor it. You will have this information on your slides. And since you're going to get this recording later, I don't think it's the best use of time for you to write this down, but you can use it at a later point. I encourage you to use that, but that, of course, isn't the only place you could find funding. Lots of other places you would find funding. Why is it? There we go. Some other places. Funny thing, nobody mentioned libraries, at least not that I saw in the chat box, which is interesting, because once upon a time that was one of the top places people would tell me that's where you would go. And it has been my experience that there are just some really wonderful, there's kind of a culture within libraries of offering you assistance. And so if you're feeling kind of like, I don't want to have to navigate my way through the website, I suggest you try going to a library in your community, probably not the tiniest library. Go to one of like the central library in the area that's nearest you. You can also go to your community college. Over the years, I've done this workshop now for 20 plus years. And over that time, I've had people come forward and say, hey, our private college, we have a found or like a somebody that helps our faculty get funding, and they're willing to help other people also. They're not going to help you write the proposal, but you could go into that office, that development office, and they will be willing to assist you. It's also true that resource librarians at all of these significant, like metropolitan or significant community libraries, they're trained in helping you find resources. And so they can assist you as you go through the looking around. So don't feel shy. Other resources, several of you said you'd go to Extension. Great idea. And I will come back to some of the internet resources, but I really appreciated that several of you said networking. Honestly, in terms of where I get most of my funding ideas of places that would make sense to go, it's really more from networking than any other source. I would say it's when I talk with people and they are thinking, I find that they have been funded by somebody to do a thing that's very close to what I wanted to do. I think, oh, wow, I didn't know that they were funding such a thing. Or I look at the newsletters and in the acknowledgement section of the newsletters, it says, this thing has been funded by, and we're grateful to such and such an institution for funding. That tells you something. There are other internet resources, and one is this wonderful organization. I'm going to come back to it. It's the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, and they have a grassroots guide to federal farm and food programs. And we worked with INSAC in putting together our guide. They put together a guide that's online, thus it gets updated. Ours does not. We make a hard copy, and once it's out, it's out. And we let people know, and this is, it will date itself quickly, but grassroots, the INSAC's grassroots guide goes into more detail than we do. We have pretty much 1 page per program. A few programs we do 2 pages, but they have all the, verbiage they wish in the world because it's online and they have the space they can choose. So they do a grand job. They tend to go into, thank you, good idea. That's whoever put that up there. They do a grand job of putting out information, and it can get into a lot of the policy details, but it gives you a lot of useful information. USDA Agriculture Marketing Service has a list of programs that can be helpful to you that pertains to a lot of the things that many of you asked about. Likewise, NRCS has program resources, and here's a page for that program resource page. Also, several of you asked about, for example, minority farmer resources and small farm resources. And Larissa, if you would be willing to put those links that I sent this morning up there, that would be great. I'm trying to move this and it's going slowly. So you could, and maybe you want to, write grant proposals just about every weekend and every evening and every day. But I can't imagine anybody wanting to for fun or for purposeful programming either. I mean, it's just important to be selective. And you have to think before you decide you're going to put in a proposal, how can I make sure that what I'm trying to do is best suited to the program that I'm applying to, and that the programs that I apply to are best suited to my purposes? How can I do that dual thing? Once upon a time, the Risk Management Agency had me do this workshop quite a bit around the country. And the program director at the time used to say to me, Margaret, the most important thing that you say when you're doing your grant writing workshop is the point that you want to find programs whose purposes and available resources seem most suitable to you. And your question needs to be, how can I advance the purposes of that program? Not just can it serve me, but it's going to be evaluated against whether the thing that the applicant is doing advances the purposes of the program. And if you think of it that way, it helps you become a little bit more selective. So some other funding questions you want to ask yourself. Well, there's the first one. This is the one that made my friend Bill Buchanan get tears in his eyes. He'd say, oh, tell me this again. Would your project advance a program's stated mission and goals? Every program it didn't come into existence for no reason. There was actually a need. A lot of folks pushed their elected members of Congress. They created a program in a farm bill, probably in our world, in this particular sphere, went into the farm bill, and it got developed to serve specific purposes. So that program has very clearly articulated mission and goals. And we'll come back to where you find that information out, but that's important. So would your project advance the program's goals and vice versa? Can you say to yourself, this program will help me do what I want to do? Is the program's form of assistance appropriate to your needs? Some programs, for example, will not be funding individual farmers doing what they are wanting to do. They are wanting to fund organizations that will help farmers with technical assistance, for example. And maybe what you're really not looking for is technical assistance. You're really looking for actual dollars. So make sure that what they're offering is what you want. Also, how big is the funding pool? Once upon a time, there was a program that I did work to get funding for all the time, but it never sought bigger amount of money. It was always at $1.3 million for 10 or 15 years. Might still be now for all that I know. And, the chances, if you got a grant through that program, you probably didn't stand as good a chance of getting a grant as you might if you were to apply to a $40 million program, for example. So one question is, how big is the funding pool? What's the average amount of grants funded? What the duration of those grants? But also, is there a limit to how much funding you can get? There are a couple of other funding questions. We'll come back to duration. It's a time question, but is that funding available from the start, or do you have to, more typically, pay for the costs that are associated with your project and then get reimbursed later? That's much more common. It's not always. And one of the things that we're entering into the part of this workshop where I say to you, and we'll say again a few times, every program is different. It came about for different purposes. It's administered within a different agency. It's remarkable to me how much culture there is around each program. So you can have had an experience with one program in one agency, one even sub-agency within USDA, and it could be quite a different experience from another program within an agency. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Don't assume that just because you've had one experience that it's like every other. And that's true with around reimbursement. Some programs are more open to offering upfront funding. A big question for any grant is, am I eligible? Who is eligible? An example of this is the Value Added Producer Grant Program. I had some questions about the Value Added Producer Grant Program, so I'll speak to that one here. Only farmers and groups of farmers can apply to VAPG. I work for a nonprofit. We can't apply to VAPG. Cities, counties, other states, you can't apply to VAPG unless you're a producer. It's a Value-Added Producer Grant Program. There are other programs that producers don't apply to. There's a program called the 2501, the Outreach and Technical Assistance Program for Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Veterans. And that program is really targeted at organizations working with producers. And it's specifically targeting socially disadvantaged producers, but it's not directly for farmers. And so each one has its own target audience. Each one has its own match requirements too. Some programs don't have match requirements. Some of them have one-to-one match requirements, and they can vary within an agency. I have had this experience this year that we applied at the encouragement of our state NRCS director, state conservationist, for a program, and it did not have match requirements. And it ended up not getting chosen. But then they said, why don't we work together on another one? But you will have to come up with rather quite significant amount of match. So it can vary. Are there restrictions on a program's use? For example, go back to VAPG. VAPG will not cover bricks and mortar. That is to say, buildings and construction facilities. It'll cover operating costs, and you can use it for planning grants to get feasibility studies done, but you can't use that. A lot of people have dreams of having a grant pay for their land. I'm thankful that none of you actually wrote that in your questions. So I think you must have figured this out. But there are an awful lot of people who are wishing that someone would just pay for them to have a farm, and that's not realistic. So you just need to know what a grant can and can't do. Back to time. Are a program's application deadlines and funding timeframes suited to your needs? And also, what is the duration? Are you needing a grant for 3 years and the only grants you can find are for 1 year at a time? And I suppose vice versa, but that's really more common, that you're wanting longer and the grants are for shorter, but you want to figure out what's needed. And then, does the program fund multi-year projects? There's another timeline thing, which is some programs have taken compassion. If it's a kind of a complex program, they've created a pre-proposal stage to kind of weed out people so they don't have people waste their time if it's really not suitable for their program. But of course, that puts an extra amount of time between the original application and when you might ultimately get funded. So keep in mind there's some time lag in here, and you want to know what that is. And then there's this last one that I call the hassle factor question. Do past grantees feel that a program's reporting requirements were reasonable and that the program is well administered? There are programs that are just a nuisance, frankly. And I have had a few experiences over the years, not that many, honestly, but it happens. And there are some programs that are beautifully administered. So it's kind of worth finding out what the hassle factor is. And I'm moving on if it will let me. It doesn't seem, there it goes, slowly but surely. So you say, and some of you actually literally did say in your questions ahead of time, how do you find out? How do you find out the answer to all those things? First of all, and most important, read the request for proposals, sometimes called a call for proposals, request for proposals, a notice of solicitation of applications, request for applications. They're all the same thing. And they are usually written in very small print. Sometimes they had to go through all sorts of legalese, and it ends up being clumsily written and frustratingly written and hard to read. And what I say to people is, don't read it once, read it at least 3 times, but when it comes time to writing your proposal. But from purposes of just deciding, is this program suitable for me? Read it. It's going to tell you so much good information. And you can find that information from linkages on grants.gov. You will find links in the book that we already showed you earlier, the Building Sustainable Farms, Ranches, and Communities. You can and really should participate in webinars for potential applicants. When you see an announcement of a program, very commonly, it used not to be so, but increasingly, programs very commonly will say, we are announcing a webinar. And it's a chance to have people in real live interaction with the program staff walk through the call for proposals and learn all sorts of the things and have questions answered. And you can almost always find your question answered. But if not, you can ask it yourself. Many people, many program staff will now these days record those webinars. And so you can find it even if you couldn't make the actual webinar at the day of. And then you can always, if none of that has answered your question, you're still not clear, does this program work for me against all those questions we walked through? Call the program staff. Their information should be on the website and the RFP, and you can find emails. These days with COVID, sometimes the phone numbers aren't very useful, but you can find usually an email. So don't be shy. And for some of those questions, like the hassle factor, you're not going to get that answered by anybody but past grantees. So you might want to figure out who's been funded and talk with them. I think that's getting close. Before we go there, I'm going to do a couple things before we even come into questions. So I thought it would be helpful. I know not all of you have downloaded or gotten a copy of this guide. I'm going to put myself back on video here for a second here and just sort of walk through a few of the programs in this guide. And I'm going to show you a little bit about how it's organized. We shifted a little bit this year. And I just wanted to point out a little bit to you. We designed it by programs by category. So we have programs clumped here under economic development for farms, businesses, and communities. We have farm loans, a whole bunch of programs there, insurance and risk management, local food systems, value added, and marketing innovations. I'd say a lot of you are going to be wanting to go to that. Another whole cluster under natural resources conservation and management. Another big cluster under nutrient and consumer food access, another bunch under renewable energy and energy conservation, and then another bunch under information, whether it's research, outreach. There are a bunch of programs there. And so I wanted to say, in addition to that, this year, the staff at Microfield's Agricultural Institute, the conservation, our policy associate is Donnell Richards. And I think I saw Donnell, you were on this call earlier. If not, I just want to say he did a really great thing, which is he kind of classified programs with a little symbol. So you can see on the side, I'm going to just show you up close. You will be able to see on the margin of the book these little symbols that let you know as you're going through, hey, this one's pertaining to something suited for a farmer. Hey, that one's pertaining to energy, and that one, so forth. And that's intended to make it more user-friendly. And then at the back, we have an index, just an alphabetical review. We shifted that around a bit from the previous year. We thought that would make it more user-friendly. We hope it's true. I thought it would be good just to go through a few programs because in response to what a few of the questions were ahead of time. One of them is, I thought it would be good to point out that for those of you with the book in hand, on page 75, there's a beginning farmer and rancher development program. This is for groups that are working with beginning farmers. It's actually not individually helping beginning farmers. I mean, it's not a thing to a beginning farmer directly applies to. It's intended to help beginning farmers. And so I just want to be clear with folks what kind of assistance you are going to get. There is quite a lot of interest in value added, but also community food issues. And so I thought I would point out a couple of the programs, the Farmers Market and Local Food Initiative. Small, I just saw it right here. Hang on a second. And I wanted to find the page and point it out to you. These are grant programs that are really designed to help people working on issues of not just farmers markets, but direct marketing of all kinds and institutional marketing and development of the supply chain. And increasingly, we have found during COVID how important that work is. And there are places now where we have programs designed that the Farmers Market and Local Food Promotion Programs on page 30, for those of you who have a copy of the book. There are some others that I just wanted to point out that are around community food projects and competitive grant programs designed to help impoverished communities, even within wealthier communities. But if there is a sub-community that is struggling with community food security, it's intended to help, and to help not in a kind of a Band-Aid way, but to help in a more penetrating way. And there's specific funding designed to assist there. So that's called the Community Food Projects Competitive Grant Program. There were several folks who asked questions about small livestock, not surprisingly, given this audience. And I wanted to point out a couple of things. One is the natural resource conservation and management section in here gives you a lot of largely NRCS, but not only NRCS programs. But there are a number of those programs that have helped any number of farmers that I work with. And you can work to get some funding through the Conservation Stewardship Program or through EQIP. One of the questions ahead of time was about the variability within a program. And, that's not a surprise. When you have a program that's as big as NRCS, you can imagine it has county staff, district conservationists, and their staff. And it's going to vary because wherever there are people, there will be some variability. If you ever found yourself feeling that your program, that you are somehow not succeeding at getting the assistance that you felt you should have, and you have worked with your local staff, you absolutely should go to the state office and say, I'd like to explore possibilities. I don't feel that I'm getting quite the help that I should be getting. You can look it up online or in your phone book and directly go to them and get some assistance. There are programs where there is some variability. I'm not particularly saying it's within NRCS, but I think it's inevitable that with large systems, you're going to have some variability. So make sure that you don't feel that you shouldn't talk about it. If you've got questions, you should absolutely speak up and ask for assistance. One of the programs I want to point out, because it speaks to several questions that a number of you had, it's on page 90 in the guide, and it's the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program. It's a program that's very interested in working to support and I'm speaking for the North Central region, so that's the 12 states in the Midwest. I can't speak for all of the region of the country of SARE. I suspect it's true, but I know in our region, there's a very high priority placed upon serving minority farmers, socially disadvantaged farmers, farmers who have historically not been served as well by USDA as they should have been. And there's just no mincing words. People aren't shy about saying this is a priority. And it's really important that if you are interested in a number of topics that are suited for a small experiment, a research project on your farm, an outreach project, you should consider going to the SARE. You can go to sare.org, SARE.org, and take a look within your region and see if one of the projects and one of the programs that's tailored for small scale, not necessarily small size farms, but a farm that's a project that's targeted at a farm scale. You can absolutely consider putting in a farmer or rancher grant. And you don't have to, they're not sophisticated, hard proposals. They're manageable proposals. You sometimes, most regions, can collectivize. In the North Central region, you can. I think that's true for others, but I noticed we have people here from all around the country, so I'm wanting to speak more broadly. You can not just have you put in a proposal, but you and two others can together put in a proposal and multiply the amount that you would have gotten for one and have a slightly broader proposal. Keep in mind always that your question that you should be able to answer is, how does what I'm doing address this program's purposes? And SARE is about research and education. So as you take your initiative forward, ask yourself, who would learn from the thing I'm wanting to do? And orient it around the inquiry that you're going to pursue and the people who you're going to target to educate about whatever you find out. And I can tell you that those projects have really helped plenty of folks. I have known people who said, boy, I was about to use, get a shredder. What do you like? I can't think of the word for taking wood chip, make a chipper shredder and use it for my raspberry patch. And I looked up and then somebody else had gotten a grant and had developed a study about whether it was practical. And they didn't find that it was. And it really made me rethink it. And it saved me a lot of money. So one of the things you can do with SARE is just look to see what other people have done before you do it too. And they have a search system to find out who has been funded to do what all around the country. That's something that you can go on their website and find. I'm not going to take the time right this minute to do it. I think I'm going to pause because those covered most of the questions you all had ahead. I'm going to give it another couple of minutes if anybody has questions before we go forward into basics of grant writing. I'll look in the chat box and see if there are any questions here that you all want me to speak to. Looking for grant funding, legal issues surrounding organizing farm partnerships between landowners, investors, and farmers. I'm guessing I don't know quite where you are, but that I would tend to think that that is not a federal agency grant, that is something that you would be wanting to pursue with private foundations. I don't myself know of any other than potentially some of the larger research programs, but let me just take that back. I guess I think it's conceivable now that I think about it. That could be, I could imagine that as a SARE project, for example. I could imagine you could do a study of what kind of business partnerships might work and develop some educational materials about which ones have worked in your region, which ones, what the constraints were, what the challenges were, and be very clear about how you would educate. And that seems to me it could be actually a SARE proposal. That's the only program I can think of that it would maybe make sense. Perhaps potentially the beginning farmer rancher, the BFRDP, Beginning Farmer Rancher Development Grant Program. Possibly you could build that into some of your programming. Those are just the places that occur to me. If anybody else has ideas, please feel free to put them into the chat box. This is a community effort, but those are the ones that occur to me that you could potentially go to funding for. Interested in grants for, oh boy, it's hard to catch it. It goes so fast. Startup farms, ranches for disabled veterans. So the 2501 program that I mentioned earlier, the outreach and assistance, technical assistance for socially disadvantaged farmers, ranchers, and veterans, that program is, if you look it up on USDA, do USDA, 2501 and do a Google search, you will find that. And that's probably the easier way to find it than that long name. But they actually do intend to offer technical assistance for veterans. And so I think that might make sense as a place to start. If I were looking to get assistance, the other two places I would go are the National Center for Appropriate Technology, which has a really wonderful program called Armed to Farm. And if you look up NCAT and ATRA, ATTRA and NCAT, and you go to their website, National Center for Appropriate Technology, they can provide you information on Armed to Farm. And then I'm going to get it wrong, the National Farmer Veteran Coalition also has done work in that area. So let me just see if there are others. Building a greenhouse to raise spices, food, and flowers. One of the things to mention here that is worth exploring is there is funding within EQIP, the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service. They have funding within EQIP for high tunnels or greenhouses. It isn't a greenhouse in the most traditional sense. It's a high tunnel, but it is for purposes of extending season. And they actually have funding to allow you to do that. So I'm going to...
Margaret, there were a couple questions that came in towards the beginning of this section. Would you like me to read them to you
I love it. Thank you.
Okay.
And I think we should ask because we only have time for maybe one more because we have to really bump into.
Okay.
Right. Go ahead.
So the question from Iris is, if your project incorporates more than one agency, is it practical to limit proposals specifically for one agency, or can you cover all your project needed into one written grant?
Such an excellent question. Thank you. And actually, I'll directly answer that in the next section. You definitely should tailor every single proposal to one agency. That agency is not going to go over to another agency and say, hey, we ought to do this together. Ain't going to happen. Does not the way they work. So you should look at the call for proposals for this agency and make sure that the good idea that you have is really well represented in meeting the expectations of that call for proposals. And you can apply to another agency for the same thing. And if you were to get both of them, you would have to reconcile it one way or another, which is usually a happy problem, and it does occur. But the biggest, the biggest point is you can't get money from two agencies for the same thing at the same time. That would be double dipping. But you almost always can, reconcile it and say, I'm going to do this one first, then that one, or I'm going to do this one in this area, and then that one. I'm going to do this dimension here, and then that one. But you can get funded from two agencies, and you can absolutely apply. Just make sure your application is tailored to the specific intentions of and requirements of each call. Do I have time for one more or not? Should we?
Well, this is that was asked by several people, but just grants for people with disabilities, and they mentioned that they know about agribility, but wonder if there are specific grants or program for target that population.
I do not know other than agribility. Agribility is the one program that I also know about, and I don't know of others. It doesn't mean that they don't exist, but I don't know of any others, and I would welcome anybody who does. Please put it into the chat box. And I am also willing, after we're over, to do a little, checking around and seeing if there's something that I don't know about and pass that word. But, and put it back to, you can send it out to folks later, but I don't know of any other. So I'm sorry to have to give you that answer. That's one of the great truths that over the years, one of the things that these workshops have done is they have, for me, highlighted areas where we don't have something that we need. For years, people asked me about local foods initiatives, and we didn't really have much funding. And we really pushed in farm bills for a couple of 3 farm bills to build up that capacity. And it may be that this issue of disabilities is an area where we ought to be really working very intentionally and harder. So thank you for the question. And I'm sorry that I do not have the answer that I would love to be able to give you. So I think we best dash because we are now squeezing time. We're coming into some basics of grant writing. And I guess in the interest of time, I'm going to just quickly let us do this very quick return to interaction. If you were going to give a piece of advice, those of you who have written proposals before, what would you say are the one or the two most important pieces of advice to give to folks? Put it here in the chat box and we'll just watch it scroll and I will call them out as I see them. The 1 or 2 most important things to keep in mind for people as they're putting in a proposal. Looking forward to seeing your advice. Meet the deadline. Yes. Be specific. Meet all criteria. Identify other sources of funding for matching. Yep. Have your money stuff in order. Outline and stay organized. Yes. Great. Where to find help? Okay. Be concise. Have somebody else read it. Yep. Make your goals measurable. Specific wording. Be concise and descriptive. Great. All right. Let's jump in. Thank you. It seems like we've come close. We've come down to the end of that. All right. Start early. Give yourself a lot of time. You will need more time than you think that you'll need. I always say read the call for proposals at least 3 times. I said this one time at a grant writing workshop, and then when we do them here in the state of Wisconsin, sometimes as we go around the state, we invite somebody who has gotten a grant to come in and just talk to people about what the process was like and what they're now doing with that grant and so forth. And this guy said, well, I came to this workshop and Margaret said I should read it 3 times. I'm telling you, you should read it 5 times. And, what I say to people is the first time you're just going to be offended by the tiny print, sometimes the seeming illogic, the frustrating language. Hang in there. Get yourself another cup of coffee and or a brownie or whatever you crave, and then come back to it. Read it the second time and you're going to start to say, oh, yeah, okay, I get it. And then you want at least one more time for cleanup and make sure you haven't lost anything. Follow its instructions. I use an outline to keep it logical. You'll see in a minute that one of the versions of that, but I just think it's really practical. When I'm starting and writing in a section, I don't start with verbiage. I start with the concept and the skeleton of the idea. That's what my 4th grade teacher probably said, and it's good advice. Break your work into sections so it's not too scary. Use the checklist, and if they don't have a good checklist, make your own. Here's an example of one that for one of the projects that I'm doing right this minute. I changed the names of my colleagues, but here's what we have to get done. We have to get the cover sheet. We have a project summary, project objectives, and I label them green when they're already done, and then I come back. And the ones that haven't been done, they stay red. And then as they get done but haven't been reviewed, I make it orange. And then somebody, one of my colleagues said, it's orange, it's not quite completed here. But this is a really great way to get through. And I put in the word count, like how many words are we allowed for this section? And where are we on that? And so forth. So that's just an example of a simple system to have everybody, I do it on a Google Doc, everybody can see it. Some of the other things you all said, and it's so true, use simple language, clear language. And somebody said, you explain how your proposal advances the call for proposals goals, the program goals. Absolutely critical. Be precise, be accurate, don't exaggerate. And, when you think, oh, if I just stretched the point about the need, and if I just overpromise a little bit, don't just trust that if this idea is a good idea, and you've tested it with your other colleagues who are your partners in putting this thing together, and you've really refined it, trust yourself, defend it. Don't feel that you have to prove anything that's beyond what you really can do. Don't try to make the need greater than it is. It's already demonstrated itself to you. It's important. Depend upon that truth. Develop your team of collaborators. And I can tell you, just last night, we had one of our team for the proposal one of our proposals that's due in the next week. So she's actually not going to be on this proposal. She'll be in another one. And she came in on this proposal and just gave us the best review and said, I'm stepping back. I don't think the reviewers are going to understand X, Y, and Z. I don't think they're going to see that connectivity. I think you ought to rethink this point and rethink that point and make the case in this way and that way. That was the most helpful thing. Of course, that requires giving enough time to have an idea and to have a proposal assembled that she had time to review. But it's been really valuable to have a good team, not a huge team. And it's for people who are insecure about their writing, have somebody not only look at the logic and the connectivity, but also the writing. It's also perfectly fair game. Make sure your budget is accurate. One of your responses was like, make sure the money is good. The money stuff is settled. Absolutely right. I tell people, don't put anything in your proposal that isn't asked for. As a reviewer, I used to just get these big, thick things in the mail, these big proposals, and I would go, oh my Lord, what makes you think I want to review that when I've got a child soccer game to go to? Yikes. It did not impress me. I used to think, do you think that that's going to wow me? Or do you think it makes me think, oh, brother? And it made me think, oh, brother. These days, it comes electronically, but it's still true. Don't send things that are not requested. If it's requested, do it well. And if it's not, and you're still think, boy, is it really important, maybe you can ask. But anyway, the one exception to that is budget narrative. Not every proposal asks for one. Virtually every federal program will, but you should anyway offer a budget narrative. That's really important. It helps you explain all of those things that numbers can't always explain. So definitely that's important. One of the reasons you want to have enough time is you have to have letters of support. So I just have, on a couple of these proposals, I'm in the middle of getting letters of support. And what I do is I either offer thinking points, or sometimes I just, if they would like to have me do a draft, but don't make them all the same. Make sure every single letter respects the individual viewpoint of the person who is submitting the letter. And so why does this idea matter to them? If they're coming in as an advisor, if they're coming in as a partner, what are they doing and why it is important? And then be sure letters of commitment are far better than letters of support. Letters that say what they are, not only this is a great idea, but I'm committing XYZ. That's a good letter. But don't have them be all the same. It takes some time to get good letters of support. Make sure you've thought through who those people are that you want to have communicating about your project. Try to understand what the review process is and understand each section of the proposal and how much of a point value it is. Don't spend all your time on something that's going to give 5% and neglect something that's going to be a 30% part of the way the proposal gets scored. This is the time when I say you don't really want to live your life feeling paranoid, but it is really useful to wake up in the middle of the night and think, oh, I know what's wrong with that proposal. Give yourself the time to be anxious and then to correct the problem. I just realized I had never gotten it big enough for you again. Sorry. Give yourself time to fix those problems. This wonderful help from our colleague came in plenty of time. We'll have plenty of time to fix it, and it will definitely make the proposal much stronger. Follow the format exactly. Don't think you ought to get creative. Get matching funds, named partners, all that stuff lined up ahead of time. And I said this in answer to the question earlier about 2 different agencies. Adjust your proposal for every single program to which you submit it. I can't actually read this bottom thing. I don't know if what I'm writing is hard for you all to see or not. Oh, have I just blown it? I may have just goofed up. Oh, I ended it. Oh,
No,
I'm sorry.
it's okay. I'll pull it right back up.
Trying to be able to see my writing, and I did the thing I wanted to.
No worries. We still have it. Here you go.
Grateful to you. Thank you. Well, so and I know what it said. It said submitted well in advance of the deadline, obviously. And the reason for that, and this is particularly true when it comes to things having to do with grants.gov. Remember I said it's the website you're going to love to hate. It can drive you crazy. There are 2 or 3 things you need to know. You will need to have, to submit through grants.gov, you will need to have a DUNS number. This is just basically kind of like an identity number. And then you need to have a System for Award Management, SAM number. You can get those easily, but you have to give yourself enough time. The other thing is submit your proposal early. There have been periods when, if you think of grants.gov as a funnel through which a whole lot of different agencies are submitting things, it does get jammed up. And there have been times when I've known people who put in proposals they had worked weeks on, and they submitted it the day of or even evening of the deadline, and it never got through the queue. It got jammed up. So do it early, and then you do not have to worry about it. And there sometimes are a few glitches associated with grants.gov too, like if you have a PDF file, if the name isn't short enough, sometimes the system doesn't like it, and it won't tell you why it's rejecting it. It just won't like it, and you have to figure it out. So there are all these little things. Give yourself enough time so you don't panic. I think the most important thing, these are the things to avoid, and I won't elaborate on this anymore. I've spoken to most of them, but the most important one is don't be discouraged. And if we were all in person, I would ask everybody to raise their hand if they'd ever written a proposal before. And then I would ask everybody to keep their hand up if every proposal they had ever written had gotten funding. And virtually always, all the hands go down. Sometimes one hand stays up. But basically, the truth is, most people who write proposals don't get every proposal funded. And that is not inherently a statement of the value of your work or your thinking or your initiative. Sometimes there's just not enough funding to go around, and for whatever reason, So find out what the reason is. Find out why you didn't get funded before you write it again, before you write another proposal. I'm trying. There it comes. So the typical grant application has the following components in it. The project summary, and it may be called something different, but fundamentally, what are you going to do and why are you doing it? What is the need for the thing you're doing, the goals and objectives and the facts that support them? What's the approach and the method? What are the things you're going to actually do to take that to reach the goal? What is the timeline and the work plan? How long will each step require? And they want to tell you, have you say who you are and why what you're doing is so suitable. Why are you such a great candidate? And then talk about the personnel and the credentials, key staff. Sometimes this is called collaborators, sometimes core team, all sorts of things. The budget, what's it going to cost? And by it, you should have gotten in your handouts a budget document, like a budget handout that I got years ago and share with permission from the extension agent in Iowa who produced it. This is not quite 2 decades ago, but I've modified it, but like it. And it fundamentally is, it offers 2 versions of budget. One is an expense category and then another is by objective. And with federal grants, you're going to need to do both. You're going to need to say, I break down my work against the objectives that I am advancing. So, you could say I have, and there's an example in there of how you take this work. It's on sweet corn and doing a feasibility plan for a sweet corn processing. And you first are going to go through this kind of an analysis, and you're going to do the outreach. And each one of those is an objective. And each one of those objectives has dollars associated with it. And in each case, this is going to want to know what kind of non-federal match can you contribute? Why non-federal? There's a long, strong idea that if you're using federal dollars, if you're asking for federal dollars, you shouldn't be using federal dollars to match. It's kind of like, taking from Peter to pay Paul. So they want to see non-federal match. Let's talk a little bit about match for a minute. Match comes in 2 forms generally. One of those is cash match. It's, how much actual dollars do you have in the bank? And the other is in kind, in-kind, in kind match. And that means everything else, basically. It means personnel. It means if you have facilities that are available. It means if you have volunteer hours that can fall under personnel, and you can monetize, you can attribute to the value of their time and give a monetary value to it. That's personnel. Bottom line, match requirements especially vary from program to program. Some programs will say, if we don't let you use our program dollars for a certain use, you can't claim that use as a match either. So for example, I gave you the example of value-added producer grant program, and you can't use the facilities. It doesn't pay for the construction of a facility. You can't therefore use that facility as a match. That's that program, not every program. So be particular about what you're allowed to do. And again, if you don't know, ask. Again, back to your grant writing typical format, then they will ask, how are you going to communicate your work? And then how do you measure your progress? How do you evaluate whether you've done what you intended to do? Some typical requirements for attachments. These support or commitment letters, lists of organizational officers, the income and expense statements, budget for the current fiscal year. These are all pretty common sorts of things that you might have asked. You will, if you're a nonprofit, you will have an audited financial statement. You will have an IRS federal tax exemption determination letter. You will need to put in the program budget. You will need to put in the agency's annual budget. And then there's this bunch of stuff that you will, when you first hit it, you think, oh my gracious, look at this. Things like current and pending support. You have to say, basically what they want to know is, Are you applying for something for which you do not have the time to actually do it? So they're wanting to know, like, tell us more about how your time is budgeted. They want to know what other funding you've got and what percent of your time is committed. And they want to know what kind of conflicts of interest, lists of people that shouldn't be reviewing your proposal. They have things about non-drug workplace and you won't lobby with these dollars and a bunch of that kind of stuff. Basically, when you write proposals, you want to make sure you've got the best possible information. So, several of the obvious things to do is participate in the webinars. If you've read the proposal 3 times and have still got questions and you've seen the webinar, call the program staff. Really and truly, program staff do want to hear from you. It kills them to have people say, well, I didn't submit because I didn't know, They want you to apply. Find the resources that can help you. We've already talked about a few of them. And then if you have challenges with grants.gov, they actually have a helpline, and it's a good helpline. And if you're persistent, you will get help. That's important, and don't be shy. A few other resources I wanted to share with you. And it may come, it may not come. There we come. We actually at Michael Field's Agricultural Institute have several documents that you can use, including some of what you've just seen. We also offer in the Midwest free grants advising. We really don't want somebody to not put in a proposal because they didn't feel secure about putting it in proposal. So especially targeting underserved farmers and other stakeholders or groups assisting them. And you can get that information by going to grants@michaelfields.org. But anybody, anytime, anywhere can sign up for our grants notices. That same grants advisor will send out notices of grant calls for proposals. And if you send an email to that same address right there, you can get your information. You don't have to be right in the region to do that. And then I want to know if we have, before we do questions, maybe I should take this couple of minutes and do that little piece that I said I would add in at the end. And that is just to point out the differences between agencies and foundations. Agencies, here, I can put myself back on because this is, you don't have to see anything. It's a little less personal to just looking at 2 cute pigs. So agencies have a program manager, typically for a program. That person's job is to make sure your questions are answered, to help you sometimes evaluate a question, whether you ought to do this or you ought to do that. That depends upon, frankly, each program. But what they will not do is, as a rule, evaluate your proposal. They are typically not the person that's going to be saying, yes, we are going to approve or not approve. For foundation, the program officer is the person who's in charge of that particular portfolio for a foundation. And that is their job. They are a gatekeeper. That person, when you contact them, you want to have all of your concerns lined up and in order, because that person wants to know their job is to provide to the board for the foundation a portfolio of really good proposals. And your job is to have them think that yours is a really good idea, and you're going to ask critical questions and you're not going to pursue it willy-nilly. What I typically do is I look around and see who's been funded by them, and then I call up the person I really respect a great deal who has been funded by them, and I ask them what they know, information. To be amazed what pieces of information people can share about program officers and their interests and predilections. And then you say, may I use your name? And in the subject line of an email to that program officer, you say, such and such a person suggested that I contact you. And you reach out, and there hopefully begins a relationship. Some programs increasingly say, you're not allowed to apply. We will contact you if we want you. And that is harder. And you then have to do a little bit more digging to figure out, how do you get over that hurdle? What do you recommend? What do people think? And would you be willing to put in a good word for me with a program officer, that kind of thing. Another thing to keep in mind about funding with foundations is, whereas typically an agency program happens once a year, they have one call for proposals typically. More typically, foundations have at least 2, often 3, sometimes 4 dockets, as they would call them, periods where they're reviewing proposals throughout the year. And so you want to find out when is the next docket. You want to talk with the program officer and find out when is the time when you can, which is the one that you should be targeting, and pursue it with them that way. When you develop a relationship with a program officer, it is a relationship, and it's an advocacy relationship, and you need to understand it as such. It's not just an informational exchange. You are making an impression, and they are the person who's going to make the determination whether your proposal goes forward or not. So you approach it with the best kind of homework you can do, and all the social capital you can bring to it, with all of the respect and dignity your work demands. But don't think that you're just calling up and asking for information. There are a couple of other points, but I think I'll instead just pause and say, we could do quick questions, maybe for 2 or 3 minutes. I'm happy to stick around for a few extra minutes, but I am done, and I'm happy to open it up.
Thank you, Margaret. That was phenomenal. I just scrolled up a little bit. I found a question that was kind of buried. Drew was asking about help applying for FSA microloans, and if you have any advice on that front.
Well, I would first ask if there is a need for help. I mean, most of the FSA programs, you actually can talk with your FSA office and ask for help. I would say, if you have applied and you've gotten problems and you've encountered difficulties, that's sort of a different set of questions. And so if what you really need is to have somebody walk you through the available resources, I would start with my FSA office. And, they have staff to help. If you've done that and you did not feel satisfaction, you did not think you were treated as you should have been treated, you can do one of 2 or 3 things. In some states, there may be an advocacy group that can work with you. North Carolina, the Rural Advancement Fund International, works with folks in the Midwest. FLAG, the Farmers Legal Action Group, works with folks. And, there are those kinds of groups that are prepared to help advocate. But I think that you can also go to the state office for FSA and say, I feel like I didn't communicate properly with the person with whom I spoke, and I wonder if there's someone else I could work with. And there's no reason you can't do that. And it's important. And, you should get satisfaction. Every person should be able to, not necessarily get funding. That's a different question. But I actually am glad somebody brought up FSA, because I just want to point out, the thing about grants is they take a little while. Loans can happen typically much more quickly. And given the incredibly low interest rates right now, it kind of makes sense to me, for a lot of purposes, to be looking at loans. This is not always something I would have said, but we've got a period of very low interest rates, and it sure makes sense to me that whatever we can do to take advantage of them, we should.
Excellent. Another question from Claire. She's wondering, how do you suggest finding or contacting former grantees of these programs that were successful and getting funded?
Yeah, and again, the culture is, each program is different. Some programs are very touchy about not communicating who has been funded to do what. That typically is contractual. That's typically NRCS, where they sign contracts with people, and they see that as proprietary, and so they don't make a broad circulation of everybody who's gotten a contract. But for many grant programs, most of them, in fact, I would say most grant programs actually circulate a list of who has been funded. and they have an announcement because they're making an announcement of who's gotten funded to do what. And you can usually do a Google search online to find, and if not, you can figure out from the program staff who has been funded. In the state of Wisconsin, for example, I have, because I was looking to have people willing to go to Washington with me for policy purposes to advocate for certain programs, I might call up the program leader here in the state, for example, a value-added producer grant program, and talk to that staff and say, who's been funded here? Can you show me the list? And I can use that to find a farmer who's well-spoken and able to go and talk about it. So you can usually find it that way. And if you can't, there's no reason you can't go online and talk to the national program director and say, is there a place where you list people who have been funded in the past? And very likely there is such a list, but not all programs advertise it as much as others. The SARE program is brilliant about this. They have a wonderful research tool where you can find it as easily as can be.
Yeah, they have a really nice search function.
Yeah.
Another question that came, I guess that was buried in the chat, that thanks to Sheldon and Gary, they're trying to find help to include a small irrigation system, 20, 30 acres, for converting from conventional grazing to management intensive grazing and building soil health. Apparently NRCS FSA can't help. Do you have suggestions about other programs they could look at?
Well, I'm amazed that NRCS can't help. That's remarkable. So I'm not disputing it, but that's surprising. One thing I would push back. I mean, I think that that's a time to start to talk with advocates. That's a first step. One of the things you've just done is pointed out that there's a problem here, and that's a thing to do. And I mentioned earlier the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. One of the things to let people know about is, INSAC has probably more than any other single group been responsible for the creation of the vast majority of the programs that I'm describing here in this guide. And, very actively monitors those programs and works very hard to get them properly implemented. And so it's really a good idea to be active in, communicating with groups such as yours. FACT is a member of the National Sustainable Ag Coalition. My organization is. You can look at INSAC by just going to sustainableagriculture.net. That's the website. And you can look under members and see if there's a member group near you and ask them to help advocate. There's one thing. But in the meantime, I would say the only other strategy that occurs to me, kind of off the cuff, is I would ask, is there something about this idea of this small irrigation system that is an educational opportunity where you could put in a proposal to SARE and say, here's a thing that I'm wanting to try, and I will try to communicate about the success of this strategy later. But I have to say, I'm quite baffled that NRCS can't help, and I'm wondering, have you gone to the state and not just to the local staff? Before I was convinced that they couldn't support it, I would at least check at the state level to see.
Excellent. Well, I know we're kind of over time right now, but Margaret, I will CC you on my follow-up email that will include all the links that we talked about and the slides and the recording. So if there are other questions that folks have, they at least have a way of getting in touch with Michael Fields and maybe taking advantage of, if they live in the Midwest, your assistance services. I do have just like a few housekeeping items just to mention before we sign off. A reminder that there is a survey evaluation tool that will pop up on your screen immediately after I close out of this. If you wouldn't mind taking it and letting us know your experience and ways we can improve, and how we can what we can do in the future, that would be wonderful. Like I said, a recording of the slides and a copy of the slides and the recording of this webinar will be available soon. I'll be sending out an email and then also be posting on our website and on our YouTube channel. We do have another webinar coming up in March. Steve Gabriel is going to be back with us to talk about water management systems. So it should be a really good one. And hopefully we'll have a couple more before the end of the spring as well. Those are TBD. And then keep an eye out for other services that FACT offers, including our handouts that can be customized about the nutritional benefits of pasture-raised animals, our scholarships, and all sorts of other things. So I think... do you have any closing thoughts, Margaret, that you'd like to share? No?
Thank you so much. I appreciate FACT, and I appreciate the fact that you put together this terrific kind of community sharing. And I've enjoyed doing it with you, and then I've enjoyed all the questions and participation of your members and
It's
participants.
wonderful. Yeah,
Everybody, good proposal.
okay, great. Well, thank you, Margaret. It was really, I was honored and pleasure to have you. And thanks to everyone in the audience for your participation and questions and interest. And hopefully, hopefully you learned some new skills and knowledge. So keep an eye out for an email from me. And I hope that we're able to connect again soon. Have a great day. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.